So we are here, now it's 5 o'clock, and I would say we wait maybe 1 more minute, that maybe more people will join the webinar. So a little bit more waiting, and then we'll start. Right, it's 1 minute after 5 o'clock, so it's time to start, that we don't waste the time. Welcome everyone. This is the 3rd laser talk organized by Aalto University. Laser Talks is an international organization. It's called LEONARDO Laser Talks. It is a program of international gatherings that bring artists, scientists, humanities people, and technologists together for presentations, sometimes performances, and most of all, conversations with each other and the wider public. Tonight, our laser talk is also part of the Aalto University's contribution for the Helsinki Design Week. And the Aalto University's program is titled Designs for a Cooler Planet. As well as this program is part of this year's Ars Electronica Festival, its online program within the Laser Garden that is hosted by the Laser Talks organization. So I would very warmly like to welcome all these different audiences with different access channels. So one is the Zoom channel, there's also a YouTube stream going on, and potentially there are some others. Our talk tonight is focused on the Arctic region under the theme of adaptation. The invited panelists are presenting diverse perspectives to the significant range of transformations in the Arctic, such as the new transportation routes emerging that will impact both the local and the global situations on many levels. So as this topic of Arctic, I think it's very complex, and it's maybe a bigger issue than a lot of people think, that it doesn't concern of them, but I think actually it does. And today we try to, our aim is to approach this topic from many perspectives, but also with critical questions concerning environment, geopolitical and perceptual changes affecting living and non-living entities in the regions. And Finland, of course, where Aalto University is located, is part of this kind of Arctic and subarctic region. We have 4 panelists tonight, and they will be soon introduced by Pia Fricker. And Pia Fricker is one of the moderators for tonight's discussion. She's a professor of practice with the expertise in computational methodologies in landscape architecture and urbanism. The other moderator is me. I'm Laura Beloff. I'm an associate professor in the art department, and I'm also head of the study program in visual cultures, curating and contemporary art in Aalto University. In this webinar, we also have the Aalto laser team, the core laser team present. First, we have Xenia Kaverina, who is a curator, doctoral candidate at Aalto University. Then we have Kirsi Peltonen, who's a senior university lecturer in the Department of Mathematics and System Analysis. We have Korai Tahirolu, who is an academic research fellow in the Department of Media. And we have Nitin Shoni, professor of practice in the Department of Computer Science. Now, we have first the short talks, but during those talks, the audience have already a possibility to ask questions. There's a Q&A button if you're in the Zoom, in the kind of lower bar of there you see Q&A. And that is when you click on that, you can make questions. And please do them already during the talk if something comes to your mind. And of course at the end also, but we will, as moderators, we will try to follow and pick some of them which might not have been answered already. And that's it. And now I hand it over to Pia, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Laura. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure of being here. It's nice that people are joining in while we are talking. But now, after all the introduction, let's finally start with giving a warm welcome to our guests. And we are very honored and happy that you could find the time to join us tonight, hopefully in one of the last Zoom formats, keeping finger crossed for the future, to discuss on the topic of adaptation and interconnected agencies, which is introduced through your own viewpoints and amazing work. And as Laura has already been partly explaining, we have organized this evening in such a way that each of our guests has around 10 minutes plus minus time to share with us a teaser of his or her work in relation to the overall theme, so that we can afterwards firstly have a panel discussion to be later enriched through your questions and comments. And we will keep on reminding you, kind of posting the questions, so no worries about that. I will now very briefly introduce our four guests, and I will start with Kaisu Koivisto. Kaisu Koivisto is a visual artist based in Helsinki, here in Finland, and the thematic focus on her artistic practice is rooted in the notions of place, history, and landscape, and in the different ways in which environments are represented, commodified, and stereotyped. In her works, she incorporates installations, photography, sculptures, and video. And her interests are deeply rooted in the North, its landscapes, and political dimensions. Her interest in history as well as the future has led her to explore abandoned Cold War era military areas in Eastern Europe, besides the focus she's presenting today to us. And then I kind of continue in welcoming Emilia Tikka, a transdisciplinary designer and researcher, and her work explores philosophical dimensions and cultural implications of novel genome editing technology, engaging with questions of human biomedical enhancement. And in this frame, her current research and writing focuses on investigating human-nature technology relations in techno-scientific discourse. Her practice combines critical storytelling, lab experiments, and speculative design, aiming to generate alternative modes of knowledge production in techno-scientific cultures. In addition, we are warmly welcoming Jukka Tuhkuri, a professor of solid mechanics at Aalto School of Engineering. His main research interest is in ice mechanics, and he's studying ice through laboratory experiments, field experiments, and numerical simulations. He has been a visiting scientist in Canada, the US, and the UK, and is the editor of the journal Cold Regions Science and Technology, and is leader of the Cool Hub, a Nordic research infrastructure hub on cold climate engineering. And then finally, I welcome very warmly Ingrid A. She's a lecturer in human geography at Newcastle University in the UK, and her research focuses on the intersection between Arctic geopolitics and identity, and in particular, how political actors re-narrate state histories, futures, and territories as Arctic. In her work, Ingrid is interested in exploring agency in questions of Arctic futures and geopolitics, and how political decisions are made and unmade in a time of rapid climatic change. So you see, we have an amazing kind of variation of different viewpoints and expertise tonight with us. And following the order of the introduction, I would like now to hand over to our first speaker, Kaisu. The Zoom stage is yours, and we will be closing our camera while we're talking. Please go ahead.
All right. The title of my project I am presenting is New Nuuk, Urban and Arctic. New Nuuk is a visual essay about the rapid urbanization going on at the moment in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. On my first visit to Nuuk in 2018, I was captivated by the visible changes happening in the city and its surroundings. It was striking to see old buildings and structures give way to new constructions, which are vividly visible in the barren and majestic landscape, dominated by the sea and surrounding mountains. There are a number of reasons for these changes. No view is innocent, no gaze is innocent. There are many undercurrents and interest in action when envisioning what kind of transitions the North will encounter in times to come. Greenlandic traditions and traces of the colonial past of Greenland meet the demands of contemporary urban planning and housing. Economical, political, and military interests are an integral part of the way in which the future is shaped. What kind of futures do the changes indicate from different points of view? Locally, as well as seen as a global tendency, such as urbanization. Climate change is a factor that cannot be overlooked. I am aware of my own standpoint and open-ended questions, and would like to expand my project in the next phase by interviewing citizens and researchers in Nuuk. And presenting this project is also part of the discussion I hope to be part of in the near future. I have presented these images a couple of times, and these have been in publications. And many times people are astonished that there's such urban views in Nuuk in Greenland, because the stereotypical idea of Nuuk is that it's kind of like some small houses and that's it, and some Greenlanders. But as you can see in my images, the city is really in transition. The population of Greenland is now about 57,000. And in Nuuk, it's about 19,000. And it is expected that the population in 10 years or so or less will be like more like 30,000. So changes are happening. And there you see a controversial figure, a statue of Hans Egede, who was a Danish-Norwegian missionary who launched the mission efforts to Greenland in the beginning of the 18th century, 1721 to be exact. And he revitalized the Danish interests in Greenland. And his base was in Nuuk, and that's why you have his statue there. Well, you can see it in other places in Denmark and Norway as well. But it's a great controversy, the colonial past and the needs of today and tomorrow. I really like to see these details in contemporary Nuuk, which tells about like the Filipino Greenlandic fusion food, as you saw in the previous image, as well as this set of Matryoshka dolls depicting traditional Greenlandic clothing. And of course, free Wi-Fi is appreciated everywhere. And cultures meet and cultures clash. This image is from 2019, but it could also be a strong symbol for like the time of the pandemic, meeting with a distance. All right, here we come to the last image in my slideshow, which shows the nature always strongly present in Greenland. You have the ice, you have the rocks, and in the background you see some buildings from the old colonial harbor. There are some buildings from the 18th and 19th century. But all in all, what interests me is the notion of changes going on, and it's very fast and very vivid. And as I said before, I'm looking forward to collaborating with researchers on this topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Kaisu. Wonderful images and very great kind of questions you're raising in here. I would like to just immediately, without further discussion, we can do that later on, hand to Emilia. So you can take over the Zoom stage.
Just the moment, I will be setting up. So, hello everyone from my side. Very happy to be part of this exciting event and panel discussion later. So I will be talking about speculative storytelling for Arctic survival. And as Sari mentioned, I'm a transdisciplinary designer and researcher, and also a PhD candidate at the moment at the Aalto University. So first, just a few words about my work in general. So my research is focusing on speculative and critical design approaches in technoscience. And within this discourse, more collaborative and decolonial approaches and methods of storytelling. And secondly, my research has been for some years already about biomedical research on genome editing technology, CRISPR. And I'm particularly interested on discourses of human biomedical enhancement. And thirdly, I'm researching on theoretical approaches on science and technology studies, and focusing on rethinking the human nature and technology relations. So my current PhD research kind of situates itself in the questions of the so-called Anthropocene crisis in the Arctic. And I'm especially looking at technoscientific developments and human and nature relations connected to that. And as I mentioned, my main research interest is in synthetic biology and genome editing technologies. So when it comes to ecological crisis, the hegemonic approach is the setting where nature is engineered to adapt to the changing climate. Like in this project from Harvard University, where the plan is to bring the mammoths back in order to restore the lost ecosystem called mammoth steppe. So here the techno-scientific fixes in the field of genome editing promise to tackle the ecological crisis by engineering plants and animals to adapt the changing climate. And if you want to read more about this project, there's a website included there. But I just wanted to mention in this sense, in my work, I use speculation to challenge this kind of underlining utilitarian view of nature within these plans of engineering nature on a molecular level. And I aim to challenge the setting where nature is genetically engineered to adapt to however human-made ecological crisis. And I create speculative futures kind of surrounding the question, what if on the contrary, post-human or a human optimization would mean to adapt to nature with biotechnologies? So I was bringing this question to my recent residency, which is called Art for Met. It is a 2-year project and ongoing now, so kind of in the middle staged, and I'm working with the Finnish BioArt Society within this residency. And the working title at the moment is Xeno-optimization for Arctic survival. And very importantly, I'm collaborating within the Art for Met residency with Oula Valkeapää and Leena Valkeapää. So Oula is a reindeer herder living in the wilderness of the northernmost fell region in the western Finland, close to the Arctic Ocean. And he's following the nomadic-based herding tradition of his ancestors. And Leena Valkeapää is an artist and researcher, and she and Oula also work together on artistic and research projects. So our research together has focused on to look at how modern way and technological developments have impacted the reindeer herding practice. And we are particularly interested in the change from nomadic towards more stationary way of life in Finland, and particularly Oula's personal experience on it as a herder. And this is from a book from Niels Aslak Valkeapää. It is a drawing made actually by Oula's grandmother. And you can see how this kind of encapsulates this idea how the space is getting smaller and smaller for the reindeer herders and their families. Since the project is long, there's a lot of research, so I'm just very quickly highlighting some aspects of it. So one thing we've been also looking at what is kind of different herding areas and border politics in the Nordic countries. In Finland, we have this kind of all year around pasture area, as you can see here in the map, whereas in Norway and Sweden, the areas are more based on seasonal migration. And this project will be brought into as an art installation where we have 2 stories in 2 different temporalities. And these stories will be mixed installation, mostly film stories. So first story is on Oula's contemporary life that he is filming himself and focusing on the question, how have modernity and technologization changed the nomadic movement, and what was perhaps lost within this change? And then a speculative future where nomadic movement returns. And this is a story of a different kind of a techno-scientific future. In Oula's film, which he's a filming at the moment, so it is at the moment in production. He discusses the importance of the movement as he practices the semi-nomadic herding. And on the other hand, how modern technologies have impacted in his herding practice. And what do these changes mean to him? And these pictures are actually screenshots from material Ola has been filming. And it's the film in the making at the moment. He also talks about human-reindeer relations and how they have changed, as well as the perspective on the environment through GPS tracking and following the herd with drones. Another thing he's talking about is how the culture of dwelling, which means being with the reindeers in their environment, has gotten less when the movement has become faster and more efficient with the technology. And here's a picture from a tea moment. So in a dialogue with Ola's story, we create a story of a different kind of techno-scientific future with the culture of a nomadic movement. So the second story is very much focused on the question, like, how could have technologies developed radically differently if they were developed from the perspective of more than human understanding of nature instead of the modern. And since my research is about biotechnologies, we very much focus on those in the second story. So the story about the future is very much being developed at the moment. So it's in crafting phase, but what I can tell you about it now, it is a story where the movement returns, and it is told by Ola's fictional descendant living in a time after the ecological collapse. And in the story, a herd of reindeer carries the memories of the movement in their epigenetics. It is a future where genetic enhancements are used to reconnect to what was lost and to remember again. But the idea is here is really to explore beyond this binary of with or without technology, and also beyond the idea of going back to something nostalgic. So it is an attempt to imagine a different kind of biotechnological developments, where the human is not trying to control nature, but rather adapt to its rhythm. And the idea is also to create kind of an hopefulness, but not through offering solutions, but rather to generate more questions and around these themes, and kind of to emphasize that the futures are not something pre-directed or fixed. But thank you very much for listening, and here's where you can follow up the project if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilia. That was really wonderful and inspiring. And I would now like to welcome Jukka on the Zoom stage.
Thank you very much, Pia. I will start sharing my screen. Right. So
Jukka, if you want to, you can turn on your camera.
is that so? Now my camera
Yes,
should be on.
Yes, great, wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that. So yes, it's good afternoon or good evening, and it's nice to be here. And I'd like to talk to you about ice mechanics. So I'm a professor at Aalto University, and I'm interested in sea ice. And The title I chose today is Future of Ice Mechanics, and the idea is that future means here that what has changed, what is changing all the time around us. And I also would like to make clear right away that I'm not a climate scientist. I'm an engineer that is interested in a material we call ice. And the climate scientists are doing different kinds of important research, but I'm not doing that. So I'm trying to answer to three questions today. Why we should study ice mechanics, why we are studying ice mechanics, and when we are studying ice mechanics, what we are really then doing and how. So that's kind of why, what, and how are the questions that we should consider. There's two answers to this why question. The first is what I call winter navigation. You can see a painting there, Murtaja, the first Finnish icebreaker, breaking ice, and a passenger ship is following. So that is something that has been going on in Finland for 140 years or so. So that is business as usual, just like plowing the roads. So we have this winter navigation. And of course, then we have safety issues, economical issues, legislative issues that need actions in a society. But then came global warming. And to us, it means that the object we are studying is changing. It is changing in front of our eyes. So the future sea ice will be thinner, warmer, and it will be more fragmented than before. That means that in my terms, level ice is transforming into ice flows that then are moving with waves. Level ice is the ice that we Finns are used to when we go skiing or skating on the ice outside Helsinki or elsewhere. That is, level ice is the ice that is land fast and flat and smooth. The reality is something else. It is much more dynamic offshore. But what has happened and is happening all the time, that is less and less level ice in the world, but it's broken. And when it's broken, it's affected by waves, and the ice is affecting then the waves, so it's an interaction thing. Parallel to global warming, partly because of global warming, there's a growing interest in the Arctic. And that interest is, in addition to scientific, it is political, it is military, it is economical, so there's a lot of things happening. There's good things and bad things are happening, of course. The good thing is that there's offshore wind power is coming, and that is one of the topics I'm going to a little bit talk today. With this changing environment, then what are we then studying? What are the research topics that are hot topics in ice, if that expression can be used for ice? So I have kind of picked three. Fracture of ice. We all know that we kind of know and think that ice is a brittle material. Well, it's not always brittle material at all. So the fracture of ice is complicated, but when the ice is getting warmer, the fracture is getting more complicated. And in fact, we should study warm floating ice, and there's much to do research there. The second large question is wave-ice ship interaction. So we have ice flows, we have waves, and then we have ships moving there. How they interact with each other, we don't know. We know all kinds of things about wave-ice interaction, but when we add the ship there, we don't know much. And then in these changing conditions, what are the ice loads to ships? What are the ice loads to bridge piers, harbors, and what is really interesting research topics now is the offshore wind farms. how we do this, how we study this kind of issues at Aalto, but also elsewhere. We do experimental work. At Aalto University, we have a facility called Aalto Ice Tank, seen on the left. It's just opposite the northern exit or entry of the metro. So it's easy to find. It's a 40 by 40 meter tank, water tank, 2.8 meters deep, and we can refrigerate it down to maybe -20 or so, and then we can make ice and study ice. We do field work on both poles. We travel to north, we travel to south and do field work, and then we do modeling with computers. And there you see on the right-hand side, you see our recent simulation where the ship is going in water, and then those disks are ice flows that then are affected by the waves the ship is doing. Then I tell you something about in more detail what we are doing. There's an old saying in ice community that the trouble with sea ice properties is that there are so many. And if I just then list the most important ones of these of the parameters that affect the properties, then is that salinity, temperature, strain rate. Strain rate means the velocity that we kind of load the ice. Scale, and scale means really the size of the items we are dealing with. Ice is granular material. It is important to understand the effects of grain size, grain type, grain orientation. Ice is a porous material, and so on. So there's a lot of parameters, and we should understand how they affect the properties of the ice and the fracture of ice. And especially now, I'm really interested in warm ice. And warm ice means something that is close to zero. And the fracture is important to know both from the climate research sense as the sea ice is fracturing, and also from the engineering point of view. And we have been, and how we study fracture of ice, we do simple experiments like the drawing shows. We cut a sample of ice, we make their what's called their pre-crack, and then we load the system, and then the crack runs. The second image from the left shows shows ice grains. It's a thin section of ice, and it shows how the crack has gone through the grains. And then there is images from lab experiment with a lot of measurement instruments on the ice sample, and then there's another photo showing us doing field work in Svalbard with our Norwegian colleagues. So that I think was something like maybe 3 meter by 3 meter ice sample we cut from the ice sheet by chainsaws, and then loaded it and measured what we wanted to measure. This is what ice looks like inside. I mean, as a material, on the left we have freshwater ice, and on the right we have sea ice, and the sea ice is much more messy. The freshwater ice as a material is, in fact, it's really ordered. And the grain size, each color represents one grain, and the grains are of the size of millimeters. They can be up to, let's say, 2 centimeters. So, and then in diameter, and then columnar grained ice have long grains, and the length can be the same as the thickness of the ice. Ice grows downwards. And then on the right-hand side, then there is sea ice from a sea ice sample collected from Antarctic sea ice from Weddell Sea, and it's much more messy because there's salt, and it has also been deformed. So there's kind of a deformation zone shown also there in the ice that I harvested from the ridge, deformed ice. Then I will go to three videos to show what we have been doing. The first video is from last summer, where TU Delft, the University of Netherlands, and Aalto University, together with Siemens, studied what are the ice loads on offshore wind turbines. We call it ice structure interaction, and in the video please consider how the structure is vibrating. That's the problem, that when the ice is moving and the structures are attached to the bottom, the structures start vibrating, and to understand why that happens is necessary for building these wind turbines. And it's funny that we don't understand why they vibrate. It's a question of physics, but we are not happy with the answers we have. Then I have two videos about waves, ice flows and waves. One is from Lance that Norwegians were using for research cruises, and that was when I was in the Arctic with colleagues from UNIS. That's a university sensor in Svalbard. And then the last one is ice flows and waves in the Aalto ice tank. The videos from last week. We are, with funding from the Academy of Finland on their Antarctic research program, we are studying Antarctic ice conditions. And then here comes the first video. So this is the Aalto ice tank. This is, I mean, speed. This is not in real time. This is much too fast. So we were kind of pulling. So this is that's the wind turbine, and we are kind of moving it through the ice, and you can see how the white, it's crushing the ice as it goes, and then that is how that's what the crushing looks like. Very complicated process, but we need to understand that process to dimension the build structure so that they are not overly expensive, but they don't break. Then the other image is from the Arctic. And Lance, the ship, is now, in fact, we are going south. We are exiting the ice region, but you can see clearly waves and ice flow. So this is the future of sea ice. And this is what we must start to study and what we must understand, how this kind of ice conditions, how we model them in climate models, how we model them when we study ships and structures, and this is the nature is changing in front of our eyes, and this is what future ice will look like. And of course, it's interesting that it's beautiful at the same time when it's scary, because it's changing so fast. And then the last video is then waves from the Aalto ice tank. So it is 40-meter wide, and there you see how the wave maker is creating waves, and then it's breaking the ice flows. The ice here was about 70 millimeters thick. And there you can see red Teemu in a red jacket there, so for scale. So the ice is moving by the waves, it's breaking by the waves. And then what we also then want to do is to run a ship also through this kind of conditions that we can create in the lab. And then my last slide is here. So no ice mechanics presentation is complete without polar bears and penguins. Both are very curious animals. When we are doing field work, they come to see us. And when a polar bear comes, of course, we go away, we go to the ship or somewhere else. So they are cute, but of course they are dangerous. Penguins are a different story. They also come to meet us, we are not allowed to approach them. We are not supposed to approach them, but if they come to us, there's no need to run away. And they really, as you see, they are so curious that they really come to see our equipment. There is our drill to get samples. That's, I stop sharing. That was my talk today.
Great, thank you very much, Jukka. And now I would like to welcome Ingrid on stage, and thank you very much, Ingrid, for patiently waiting. But now the whole stage is yours, so take all the time you need.
Yeah, hi. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this. I think this is such a great event. I really think it's so important that when we talk about the Arctic, we talk across disciplines. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research, which is in the field of geopolitics. Hopefully you can all see my slides okay now. I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to say a few words more generally about geopolitics in the Arctic and governance mechanisms. I'm sure a lot of this will already be familiar to most of you, but then I'll say something specific about my research and my thoughts around these topics of Arctic adaptation specifically and interconnected agencies, because the question of agency is precisely what lies at the heart of a lot of my research. And these questions of kind of who gets to have a say, so who has agency in the Arctic, who are heard in discussions, what do we even class as geopolitics? So first things to say, when I say geopolitics, I'm sure it's a term that many of you are familiar with, but I use it to really point to the relationship between geography and politics. So by geography, I also include things like the environment, as well as kind of territories and borders and the things that we might think of as more traditional geopolitics, but also kind of how does the world around us influence politics, and vice versa, how does politics influence the world around us? So my starting point is that we've seen an increased interest in the Arctic, and as the previous speakers have spoken to as well, that is largely due to these rapid changes taking place. So climate change, right? And interest in new potential resources, interest in potential shipping lanes. All of these things are happening in the region, and that's really affecting people living there, as well as, I guess, interest from abroad as well. So that's kind of what brought me to study the Arctic, I think, kind of witnessing this shift from talking about the North as almost a periphery or on the margins of global politics to suddenly becoming quite central, right? It's something that we suddenly hear a lot about in media, in relation to climate change, but also in relation to a range of other topics, whether that's kind of international relations at the UN, whether it's about military and so on. So the question that I've been interested in is how do we relate to a space that is changing rapidly, both physically, but also in terms of those social and economic and even cultural aspects to it. Those rapid changes, what does that mean for the way that we engage with a space, relate to a space? Because, I mean, what I really want to say is that I think that really matters. I think it really matters how we imagine this area and how we engage with it from afar as well as within the region. So I'm sure you all know that there are 8 so-called Arctic states that are the countries that have territories north of the Arctic Circle. And they are also the Arctic Council members. So the Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum where these countries meet and they discuss and they deliberate and they come up with shared agreements sometimes. But the Arctic Council itself does not make any decisions. And that's important to say from the outset. In addition to the Arctic state representatives, there are also 6 so-called permanent participants, and that's the indigenous peoples organizations. Unlike the states, they don't have voting rights in the Arctic Council, but they are consulted on all matters. So I'm sure, as we can talk about later, there's a lot of scope, I think, to certainly increase the level of agency of both indigenous peoples and local populations as well. But in terms of international relations, the Arctic is actually often presented as a unique case where actually these organizations are included in a way that they're not in many other parts of the world. So that's also, I think, important to bear in mind here. So my own research started from this observation that suddenly what I was used to hearing about being talked about as the North increasingly was talked about as the Arctic. Right? roughly sort of 20 years ago now. So I'm from North Norway myself, and so suddenly I was from Arctic Norway, and that was I think you know, a term that we weren't so used to hearing, and I became very interested in, well, what does it mean to have a region relabeled, or perhaps not officially relabeled, but certainly a new label becoming more and more present in people's everyday lives? Does that change how we, again, relate to the space that's suddenly circumpolar rather than being northern within a country, for example? And I saw this shift happen both in Norway, where I was living, but also internationally, that increasingly the Arctic was talked about, whereas before we might have heard more about, for example, the Barents region, the North Calotte in Scandinavia, the High North as well. Suddenly it was more about the Arctic. So I became very interested in these political discourses, and I became interested in what does it mean for identity specifically? Does it change how we see ourselves and our communities? So the first research I did was actually with Norwegian youth, and I asked them if they had a sense of Arctic identity or not. And then building on that, and I mean, the short summary of that was that feeling Arctic is something that you might feel it in relation to someone else, but not all the time. So for example, if you are in Southern Europe, it might make sense to say that, yes, I'm from north of the Arctic Circle. But when you're actually at home in Tromsø or in Lapland or wherever you're from, you're not going to be thinking about yourself as an Arctic person all the time. So that's the kind of very brief summary of that study. But then I built on that with looking at how state personnel specifically relate to the Arctic region. So these were state personnel from Norway, Iceland, and Canada, who might be from the south, and most of them would be working in the capitals, so further south than the Arctic Circle. How do they relate to the fact that their country has this status as an Arctic state? And I think what perhaps surprised me was that I expected to find a lot of talk about how, you know, the Arctic was strategically important, and this kind of re-narrating of what it means to be, for example, Norwegian as being Arctic. And actually also they talked a lot about self-perception and perception of communities and families and kind of quite personal histories in a way that was not just rhetorical. It wasn't just about kind of mobilizing political support for certain decisions, but actually also about how do we imagine our place in the world as professionals or as individuals. In all of these three countries, the ways in which an Arctic identity was narrated was in some ways quite similar. It's about, you know, being an Arctic state comes with certain responsibilities, it comes with certain rights. But the way that this sort of played out in practice was unsurprisingly quite different in each of these. And of course, these countries also have very different histories and different relationships with indigenous peoples as well. So Iceland, for example, does not have an indigenous population, whereas the other two countries do. And Canada has a very different kind of settler colonial history than Norway does, for example. And all of these things are really important for how they come to see their role in the Arctic and the kinds of politics that play out today as well. So I'll say a little bit about kind of what this so-called Arctic identity, or Arctic identities, plural, what that was often narrated as. And I think this is really, you know, I think it's relevant for how we also then imagine Arctic adaptation as this kind of future-oriented practice and how all of these things are connected together. So the first thing to say, coming back to the point about Arctic geography, is that it's not just about the Arctic Circle, it's not just about borders, but also about these quite contextual definitions of how we think about the region. So certainly, as you can see here on the slide, the different working groups within the Arctic Council, they use slightly different definitions depending on what their topic is, but also depending on what we're talking about, we might talk about slightly different things. And again, I think this is quite a crucial thing to have in mind, that making sure that we are talking about the same space, but without in that process necessarily fixing a boundary and saying this is the Arctic and beyond that is not, but rather kind of bearing in mind that this is a contextual region, as all regions are. It depends who you're talking to, when you're talking, what topic you're discussing, how we really imagine this space and what's relevant and what's not. So in addition to these kind of formal definitions and these lines you can draw on maps, the other thing that came up in the interviews that I've done, and I think always when we talk about the Arctic, is the importance of specific environments, specific climates, even the weather, how much that really influence how people imagine the Arctic. We've seen some beautiful pictures just now, and this kind of imagination of this frozen space, and how a lot of people from the south, I'm currently in the UK, the way that they imagine the Arctic here is very often this kind of frozen snow or ice covered area, right? The other aspect to an Arctic identity, so if you have geography on one hand, then history is the other one that really comes into play. And I say history, but actually I think time in general, so not just the past, but also the future. It's really important when we think about the way that we relate to the Arctic. So in terms of Arctic identities, and certainly in these countries that I looked at, the importance of history was very much emphasized, and talking about things like polar explorers, talking about kind of how that was part of nation building, state building, how those past also then come to influence the kinds of current practices that are taking place in and through the Arctic Council, for example. But then the other aspect here is futures, and I say futures plural, but I think a lot of Arctic politics today is about an anticipation for what is yet to come. And I think we could list adaptation under this heading as well, that we are sort of expecting and awaiting something yet to happen. So a lot of the political decisions and political discussions currently taking place is about preparing, it's about planning, it's about that kind of preemption of what is perhaps yet to come. Then that includes threats for the future, but also hopes and interests and the kinds of investments that people are willing to make in the region. So what I'm really trying to say is that in all of this, we are seeing the past and the future come together in the present. And that's the bit that is really important here, that these future anticipations are already influencing what we are doing today. Part of that, what we are currently doing today, is of course the so-called globalizing Arctic. And I've already mentioned the Arctic Council here, but the fact that these 8 Arctic states have a particular role there is of course a position of privilege. It's a position of certain responsibilities, and often we hear these terms such as stewards and enacting stewardship or protecting the region, that they have a certain responsibility. But of course, there's also certain rights, and that's something that the Arctic state representatives very often emphasize, is that as Arctic states, they have other privileges as well vis-a-vis non-Arctic states, for example. So in the Arctic Council, I didn't mention, but in addition to the members and the permanent participants, you also have observers, and they are often other states, so they can be organizations who get to observe what takes place. They get to participate in working groups, but they do not have, for example, voting rights in the council itself. The other thing to say on this is that the Arctic is, of course, very much influenced what happens elsewhere in the world. We see that with the climate, very obviously, but also in terms of international relations. And the Crimea crisis was an example of this, where suddenly Arctic relations were also influenced by what was taking place far south of the Arctic itself, kind of spilling over and spilling north. And that's something to bear in mind as well, that when we are thinking about how the Arctic may or may not adapt, it really depends what's going to be happening elsewhere too. In terms of national narratives and national identities, I've put this on the slide because I think it comes back to this point I was making about how suddenly this Arctic label is much more prevalent, and you see it a lot more around you. And again, this is kind of part of, I guess, what intrigued me. Do we think of ourselves differently when we are constantly reminded about being in the Arctic through these very so-called banal things, like, for example, branded water, or here you've got a can of beer as well, and how suddenly the Arctic is everywhere, but almost in this very not noticed. And of course, a lot of these things are made for tourists. They're made for kind of an outsider's gaze, but of course it will also influence people there, whether that's not in the Arctic Circle or certainly within these countries. I'm sure we can think about how that may or may not kind of influence how we relate to a region, and also history, how certain aspects of history. So here you've got the polar explorer Roald Amundsen, how of course he's always been part of history books, but I would argue that he's now more prevalent in kind of media as an image, and more people might know of him because of this increased interest in the Arctic region. And then finally, it's a kind of relative northernness. So even within these Arctic countries, people would talk about how there might be some people who are quote unquote more Arctic than them, who have more legitimacy to speak on certain topics. So that might have to do with from how far north you are. It might have to do with how much experience you have of the north. And so interestingly, when you go to Arctic conferences, for example, you very often hear politicians almost start their remarks by saying something about how they've spent time there, the sort of experiences they might have had going north, maybe traveling on icebreakers, the kinds of things that they've seen, almost as a way to say, I have this personal experience and therefore I have a certain legitimacy in what I'm trying to say. And then, of course, also indigeneity. So a lot of people I spoke to of these politicians and civil servants, they would talk about how they might have a sense of Arctic identity themselves, but not in the same way that, for example, someone who were indigenous might. So if you're Sami, you have a different relationship to the Arctic than if you're a person sitting in an office in Oslo, perhaps. And then finally, this local, and the term local, I think, came up more in Iceland, where without this indigenous population, there was still an articulation of what it means to be local to the Arctic region, and having, again, that sort of familiarity and familial history with it. And then finally, this kind of personal experience too. So if the kind of first half of this slide relates to communities and groups, then you also had people talk about their individual experiences. So their own kind of daily contact with certain issues through their job, having experienced the snow and cold, maybe taking part in certain activities such as skiing, ice hockey, which is very important in Canada for sure. Childhood interests, how that had drawn them to their particular role in working with Arctic topics. So really, I find it really interesting how these things all kind of came together in their articulation of what it meant to represent an Arctic state. So to kind of summarize this, I think the questions that I really want to say or raise, I guess, for our discussion would be, I think the crucial question is, whose voices are heard? You know, is it about, when we're talking about Arctic adaptation, for example, is it state representatives who get to decide what is to be adapted, what sort of adaptation is acceptable or not? If not, who else should be included? How should they be included? What topics to be included on? So, for example, I think we've seen really positive changes in recent years on more Indigenous inclusion in geopolitical discussions, but quite often they are limited to certain topics. So, for example, you have much more discussion of Indigenous language rights, for example, which is hugely important, but then you don't necessarily have the same kind of voices also being heard on topics such as kind of military, for example. So kind of thinking about who is doing the adaptation, who is involved in those discussions or not, what actions are taken, what actions are not taken, and why. You know, this is the question of agency here. What do we include when we talk about Arctic geopolitics? Because I think quite often we have a very limited imagination of what kind of goes under that banner, and then we might leave out other topics, which again then narrows the scope for what kinds of futures that are possible to imagine and kind of possible to facilitate through these political discussions. And all of this, I think, comes down to a question of justice, because as we have heard in the previous talks as well, this is a region that's marked by colonization, by past injustices, and we still see those histories. They are still playing out today in different ways. This is a region that's been marked by extraction and resource exploitation, and we still hear about so-called green colonialism today, where areas are taken over potentially under the banner of green investments. Again, who has the right to decide what is to take place or not? In any case, keeping that kind of Arctic futures imaginary open, talking about plural futures, plural opportunities as we talk about adaptation, potentially mitigation, and even development, all of these kind of future-oriented discourses that we are having.
Thank you, Ingrid. Hey, that was really interesting, and really sort of gives also an image of the politics which are going behind, which I think causes a lot of questions and fears in people. I would ask now the panelists to put the cameras on, and maybe also mics if you have the questions. So for the audience, if you have questions, you could put it in the Q&A section. And otherwise, I would first, I think, ask the panelists from each other. Do you have comments or questions for each other, or anyone who is now in the webinar? I'll give you whose voices are heard. Now you have a chance to have your voice heard. Yeah, Ingrid, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I had a question, I think both for Kaisu and Emilia, actually, because you both worked with artists and artistic practices. And I was curious about your kind of intended or hoped audience. Who would you want to speak to? Who would you want to see your work? And how would you perhaps want them to engage with it, if you have an idea of that at all?
Can I answer first? Okay.
Sure.
Well, first of all, my idea is I don't have kind of clear message. Okay, I want to illustrate this, because it's really a complex area. And as a visual artist, I'm not familiar with all the discourse going on regarding this project. But of course, I'm like eagerly learning about the topic, because as I mentioned, no gaze is innocent. There's always so many things like going on which affect the way we see. And in my case, in a way, I photograph which things I want to frame, because like framing, it's really a way of like, okay, I want to frame this, because you cannot have the whole thing, or you don't want to have the whole thing, because it's like impossible. But about the audiences, well, first of all, I like to approach my topics with curious eyes, and I hope that the people who see my work, they kind of get the same sense of curiosity. What's this and why? And I have a tendency to kind of also include contradictions in my images. That's and like contemporary things, and then how history is like visible, maybe in very small details in the things I'm looking at. But yes, my aim is to create curiosity, and I would like to have people react and maybe go and find out what's going on and not take for granted.
Yeah, thank you, Kaisu, for I guess I can continue a little bit from that. Yeah, I mean, I would also say, because in this particular project, there is so many different layers present, so I cannot really say that there is this one particular audience I want to reach. I welcome all kinds of audiences, and very interested of different kind of voices and angles. But I guess because my research field has been a lot focusing on this technoscience and genetic engineering discourse and so on, my attempt was, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, my attempt was to kind of introduce a different kind of perspectives on that field or discourse. So as I mentioned quite sharply about this utilitarian understanding of nature in this like control in the molecular level. So there my idea was really to bring different kind of stories and perspectives in that discourse. I would say, like, as a kind of a PhD researcher, that is my main sort of, but of course this project has so many different levels, so I hope there will be a lot of different audiences as well. Yeah, thank you.
In fact, sometimes when like experts from different area look at my images, they see things that I am not aware of, because I'm not an engineer, and I'm not in construction business. and I'm not a geologist, but like this area, people in different areas have pointed out very specifically what it is about. So I'm learning a lot myself all the time.
Kirsi, you have a hand up.
Yes, very interesting lecture. So from different perspectives, but I have a continuation immediately for this earlier question. I think, have you noticed a big difference from different audience? I mean, you were talking about these people from Arctic insiders or people outside Arctic areas. Do they take your art differently?
Was this a question maybe more for Kaisu? Or I have to say my previous work, of course you don't know my previous work, but this is the first work that actually deals with the Arctic that I'm doing right now. So maybe then therefore Kaisu can better answer to this, since you have probably more focused on this area, right?
My interest in the North and the Arctic areas began in 2013 when I visited Svalbard. I was on an Arctic artist residency on a sailing boat called the Arctic Circle. So that's when I really hands-on became aware of this area and began to research what's going on extensively. So from that time on, I have kind of collected the reactions and data. And I must say that nowadays people are so much more aware of what's happening than in 2013. I get a lot of reactions, not only like, wow, what's this, where were you, and so on, but really detailed questions regarding my images. Maybe it's also because I have more a focus view myself. So I can really see that the people are more aware of what's going on in the northern areas.
Jukka, you have a hand up.
Yes, I have a hand up and mic open. I would like to continue on that what Ingrid was talking about Arctic identity, and maybe you, Ingrid, can then comment on that. I have and now I'm not talking as an ice scientist, but I'm talking as a professor who has been involved in the Arctic policy in Finland. And Finland, as many other countries as well, have Arctic kind of strategies nowadays. And the Finnish Arctic strategy starts by stating that the whole Finland is an Arctic country. And that is a liberal kind of, that we can consider that is a liberal definition of the Arctic, but that is something that is kind of personally important to me. And the way I'm seeing this Arcticness in my own life, I'm from the Helsinki region. And if the Helsinki harbor requires icebreakers, it sounds rather Arctic to me. And so that's my kind of take on this. And if I'm studying sea ice outside Helsinki, outside Tammisaari, I feel that I'm doing Arctic research. And then if I'm excluded from Arcticness, I feel kind of that I'm wondering what's happening. And this is kind of the thinking that why the Finnish strategy says that whole Finland is an Arctic country. Not everybody agrees with that. And of course, then we have Lapland, which has its issues. So what is I would like to hear your reaction on this kind of definition.
My reaction? I mean, yeah, Finland is an Arctic state, and I don't think that's something that can be disputed. But whether or not people feel that they are also an Arctic people, I think is a different question. And I think that's partly what I was quite interested in. And certainly with the kind of increased use of this Arctic term or Arctic label, does that change how people relate to it. And I think I wonder, but this is completely speculative as well, whether there is a generational shift there at all. Because like I said, this is a change, you know, that Northern Norway is being talked about as the Arctic, and I think Finland as well, that you're seeing this label much more prevalent around you. That's fairly recent. And so I do wonder whether people kind of growing up today, when we look back in 20 years from now, whether they are going to maybe be, I guess, more conscious of this Arctic term than I was growing up. Maybe an Arctic identity is something that they would relate to more. And I think with traveling as well, like I was saying, kind of it being so relational, that when you do travel south, and if people south, whether that's Southern Europe or further afield, if they have heard about the Arctic and they are intrigued by the Arctic with that name, then maybe that will also change how people think of themselves. Because it actually took me moving abroad to really start thinking about the fact that Northern Norway was being kind of re-narrated as Arctic Norway, and then of course as an Arctic state as well. And suddenly Oslo is part of the Arctic in that way. I don't think people in Oslo would say that they live in the Arctic, but I think it is still true that the country is one of the Arctic Council member states, if that makes sense. So there's a bit of a kind of formal difference there. Yeah.
Hey, I have a question also, continuing actually for Jukka, as you talked about now that, okay, Helsinki has icebreakers and so on, and we all know they are there in the one harbor, the two of them, and so on. So what about in the future? Maybe there is no need for the icebreakers anymore. Maybe the identity that time is no longer thought as an Arctic identity, even if it would be considered politically the Arctic state or official in the official books. So that's one part of the question. And the next part is, this also links to your field. You know, the ice is disappearing. So what are you going to do?
It's diminishing, it will not disappear. Helsinki will need icebreakers. The Baltic Sea may need more icebreakers in the future. And the reason is that when the ice is getting warmer and thinner, it's getting weaker. And then in fact, it becomes more dynamic. So wind is moving it more, and it potentially creates more issues than a thick, stable ice cover. So no, the melting ice is not solving. Of course, I can guess what's happening next 50 years. I cannot guess what's happening during the next 100 years. But no, as long as I can think, we need icebreakers in Finland.
There is a question, Laura, in the chat from the audience. Maybe we can take that, because it relates to Ingrid and Jukka. I can just read it out. So, question for Jukka and Ingrid. While being scientists, do you find the encounter with strategies that artists are using, if you tend to consume artistic production, benefiting for your own research? And then adding on that, I refer to artistic production that both overlay with context and topics that you are working with and not. Yeah. That's the question.
Yeah, I don't know who should answer first.
Please.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thanks for the question. And like I said at the beginning, I think for me, working with people from other disciplines or from other perspectives is so important to my work. So, you know, the short answer is yes, it is definitely benefiting my work. I've more specifically worked a bit directly with a theatre director who was interested in exploring the notion of Arctic geopolitics through a theatre production, in particular through this song performance. And it really did make me also look at my own work differently. So first of all, in the work that I've talked about now, Arctic identity, how we relate to a space, how do we also then perhaps perform or kind of show these identities through artistic practices? That's something that was discussions that we have, but also even more more kind of formal or traditional geopolitics. He has been interested in kind of, I guess, generating discussion around things like resource extraction, things like the kind of claiming of space and historical colonialism and kind of flag planting in the Arctic through these artistic performances. So on stage, we had, it's not finished yet, but we had a work in progress that was shown to students and the public in Oxford, and it was really fascinating hearing what sort of thoughts it brought up, because in a very different way than what we as scientists write in articles, which has to be so precise, right? We make a very, the whole point is have a clear argument, and you need to always kind of reference where you get that argument from and what your evidence is. Through this drama production, he was able to really generate a lot of ideas in the audience themselves, and it really took a lot of different directions, because it wasn't about providing one clear answer, but almost the opposite. It was about generating lots of questions and almost generating new ideas about something that perhaps we as in my case, political scientists don't necessarily think about. Yeah, so I've benefited a lot from it already, and it's something that I'd love to explore. And to be honest, that's kind of why I was so excited to be invited to this laser talk as well, because that's kind of the idea of it, is bringing together people who got quite different perspectives.
Thank you.
I guess it's then my turn. When I said that I take part of this discussion, I was afraid of this question. And no, I don't think there is a connection between the strategies that I used in art and the strategies that I'm using in my research. At the same time, artistic things that have northernness in them, they have an effect on the northernness that I have. I read a lot about both books about that deal with both poles. And it affects my identity. I have a strong Arctic or polar identity, in fact, and so that's how it affects me. But does it really affect my work? As I showed in my presentation, we are measuring how cracks grow in ice, and we are doing really precise measurements on that happens. And then we have complicated mathematical and theoretical models how the material behaves. I'm curious if somebody can help me on this, but where I don't find the space for art there, to be honest. And as I said, I was scared that somebody asked this question, and as an honest man, I give the honest answer.
Okay,
sorry.
We have 2 hands up and 3 hands up, 1 physical and 2 digital. And actually, Nitin, I think, had the hand up first. So Nitin, if you have a question there, I would give you the stage.
I thought I would start with responding to Jukka's very honest commentary, because also as a professor in computer science, I struggle with that, but I struggle in a very exciting way with that, because I often work with artists and designers and even performance artists, which I think my department probably finds very strange. But there's something about speculative fiction, and as Emilia was trying to do is trying to do in her work, and I've seen the rest of Emilia's work somehow, it's quite extraordinary. It does give us as scientists a different imaginary about what kinds of things we should be thinking about, both ethically and in terms of our research in different ways. So while I know the kind of work that goes into modeling and AI and building systems isn't always drawn directly from artistic inspiration, sometimes the work we do needs to be challenged artistically or by historical perspectives, as looking at the work that Ingrid is doing, bringing the past, present, and future geopolitically in. I think sometimes we as scientists have to just think about where do we fit into that? What is our identity as citizen scientists and not just as research scientists? So that's something I'm always struggling with, and I take your remark very well, Jukka. But it is a really beautiful dialogue we can have. Going to that, I wanted to ask actually Ingrid something about the militarization, increasing militarization of the Arctic. Where does that fit in? Because as I know, and I'm hearing from commentary in the news, Russia has a very important military stake in the Arctic. And the Arctic isn't just, while the Arctic Council is a steward of the Arctic affects the Maldives. It affects islands that are far, far away from the Arctic. So there's a global pact that needs to be considered around the increasing militarization and threats to the Arctic. And to Jukka, the question is, what are the biggest threats scientifically to the Arctic? And how do we mediate them? Because increasingly the Arctic is going to become an important plank in climate change. So how do we deal with that? I do have a question for Emilia, which I may not have a chance to ask, but it is around reindeer herding, which I find fascinating, and how that plays into your research, and what are the ways you're using that for speculative fiction. So, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
So let's go then. I know that Kaisu had a hand up. So I say first Ingrid answers, then Jukka, and then if we have time, Kaisu can go. How's that?
Yeah, I'll try and respond briefly, but yeah, you're right. There is increasing militarization taking place at the moment. But I think what's important to say is that I don't think we're really seeing the likelihood of military conflict necessarily increasing in the Arctic. But what we are perhaps witnessing is that that events elsewhere are also affecting northern relations. But I think what's interesting about the high north is that it is this very symbolically important space as well, in particular for Russia, which of course has more than half of the Arctic Ocean coastline is Russia. And but this was also the case during the Cold War. It's been really important symbolically to show presence. It's a very sparsely populated part of the world. And so showing and demonstrating, for example, Arctic statehood through military capabilities is very important. And then, you know, it is a region where there are NATO countries as well as Russia. And even though there isn't a NATO kind of Arctic strategy per se, that interaction is certainly, or connection is certainly there. Yeah, I think that's perhaps the main thing I would say on that. I think there is a whole other really interesting conversation around climate change and the increased likelihood of conflict. But again, I don't think we're going to necessarily see that conflict in the Arctic, or certainly not starting in the Arctic. But I think that kind of global connectedness that you mentioned with the Maldives and so on, that it's about kind of global relations and how that's going to affect the North as well as vice versa.
Jukka, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you for your support on this struggle. You also asked then that what I kind of see as the threats and how we maybe can solve them. We need to struggle the climate change first. I mean, we need to stop the global warming. I mean, that's what's changing the ice. That's what's melting the ice. And so that is real danger. Can we do something that then on a local scale, can we spread something that is white on the ice? That is of course that we can start thinking of kind of geoengineering things. Those are mega projects and hugely complicated. And I have been involved in two such projects, but I don't have anything to say about those. And then in the short run, that's what kind of where my work is that when the ice is melting away, ships that do not have ice strengthening are going to places where they should not be going. There's a cruise line company offering interesting cruises from Seattle to New York through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And my strong opinion is that the ship should not be there. Maybe if it's escorted by two strong icebreakers, but why it should not be there is that if something happens, there is no infrastructure to do anything. Then it will be just a disaster. So non-ice strengthened ships should not go to ice conditions, even if they are getting lighter. And that is a risk we are currently facing.
Thanks, that was really good. Hey, we have 2 minutes, Kaisu.
Well, Ingrid and Jukka, you got a question about artistic production that's overlaying with the topics and context of like things that artists do. Well, Jukka mentioned that he cannot imagine this field in such a context, but I can. I see a lot of possibilities, both from like a visual point of view, but also like having something very much to do with the current issues, and not like only today. It has a past and it has like many futures. I can imagine. And as well as with Ingrid, I really the topics you talked about are really such things that I'm like really reading a lot about, and I'm sure they also affect the way I look at things.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So, hey, this was super interesting, and it always goes, the best talks go like this, that you don't have time. It just starts going when the time is up, and this is the case today as well. So, Ksenia, you had some list of thank yous, didn't you?
Yes, thank you all. Thank you to the participants and our attendees tonight. Really nice to have you here. And yeah, I will now just thank all people who made it possible, this tonight's talk, and start from Laura Beloff and Pia Fricker, and then Kirsi Peltonen, Nitin Shoni, and Karaita Hiroglu from Laser team at Aalto. Then I would like to thank Teemu Matilainen, who has been helping us with IT tonight, and Aalto Communications, and the team of Designs for Cooler Planet, because we are part of Helsinki Design Week tonight. I'm sending greetings to Laser Talks team, Cristiana Kazako and Daniela Sembieda. And we were also part of Ars Electronica Laser Garden. I would like to thank colleagues from Aalto Networking Platform, Christina Zinner, Katja Reinika, Heidi Henriksson. I would like to also thank graphic designer Federico Simoni and Teija Löydönen for supporting these laser talks. And we were live tonight because we got support from Aalto University and Leonardo International Society for the Arts, Sciences and Technology. So hopefully see you in the next laser talks. Laura, would you like to say something about?
Yeah, I want to thank Ksenia Kaverina a lot, because she's been the one who's actually in detail made these 3 talks now happening. So super thanks for you. And goodbye for all the audiences. The panelists can hang on and we'll shut down the channel.